Chapter 11. Only the good die young. Anya took a sip of her milkshake and threw a knowing smile at Qui-Gon Jinn she hoped looked mysterious and very mature. She had been back in Coruscant for 8 days already, having left Sereno as soon as her back felt better after a rather awkward journey she had spent pretending to sleep to avoid any question Khan might have had, and a particularly unenthusiastic GD had requested a dinner date before leaving on some Senate-related business 2 days after. She had a very strong feeling he was going to attend the nowadays famous summit. Said summit, which was now widely marketed on the HoloNews as an event of great importance by Senator Palpatine, who was organizing it, was being held on Iriadu, and already looked like a giant shit show. An organization called the Nebula Front was strongly opposed to the legislation Valorum wanted to discuss, a bill allowing the Trade Federation to arm themselves in exchange for the taxation of free trade zones. They thought that the tax would only be transferred to the Trade Federation customers, and as such, would increase poverty in the Outer Rim, while the already powerful corporation got richer and more dangerous. They were not wrong, but it was not really the main thing to take away from this. It did, however, give them a fairly good reason to attempt an assassination on either Valorum, of the Trade Federation, or both. Poor Valorum, who tried to keep it all quiet, had been betrayed by various staged indiscretions, and had to allow the press to come to what was initially supposed to be a quiet thing outside of Coruscant, to negotiate a risky bill in the utmost discretion. She could imagine he was livid, and now understood a lot better his cryptic comments during their dinner. She was very good at betting, on failures, and on situations, and in that case, she would bet a good chunk of her personal fortune, that this particular event was the trigger for the incoming Naboo blockade. Which meant, considering what she knew, that it was going to go horribly wrong, that Valorum was going to do something stupid, and that Palpatine would be there to play puppeteer behind the scene, while willingly dragging Naboo in the mud in prevision, for his grand comeback as Chancellor candidate, senator of an oppressed planet destroyed by Valorum's careless choices. "You don't look delighted to be supervising the party," she stated, amused at his dejected expression. For a seasoned GD, he was acting a bit overly dramatic. Qui-Gon looked up from his meal, unimpressed. "I am not sharing our mission's details." Anya raised a brow. "You don't have to, everyone knows about the summit." "You're not going?" he asked, the question pointed. "Indeed. Chancellor Valorum was very kind not to invite me, and I will be going on a last bit of holiday before the Senate return from break." Qui-Gon smiled and his eyes glinted humorously under the neon lights of Dex's dinner. She smiled back and rejoiced in the easy companionship they shared. Qui-Gon had not brought back the meditation incident even once during the course of the meal, and she was grateful that he settled for seeing her stable again. In some ways, Khan had done the same. Her heart warmed at the thought. She was looking forward to seeing him again tomorrow for their grand departure to Sojourn, the moon Khan wanted to steal, whatever that entailed. From what she had gathered, he didn't really know what they were going to find, but it was supposed to be a holiday planet for a Sith Lord, so her expectations were somewhat low. "What do you think of the bill?" "I didn't know you had any interest in politics," Anya retorted sharply, trying to gauge exactly where he was going with his question. "I don't call it curiosity." His gaze was more intense now, and his words carried an edge. He had identified the upcoming carnage and was baiting her for clues. She chose her words carefully. "The Trade Federation is growing exponentially. This bill is meant to slow them down, but in reality, it will drain the locals and allow them to arm themselves to the teeth. If it passes, and it will, they will still grow too powerful for the Senate to control efficiently. If it doesn't pass, they'll keep their free reign and will probably arm up anyway, with no one willing to look too closely into it. If the talks are troubled, they will retaliate." He pondered on her answer for a moment, looking calm but feeling sharp in the force. "It sounds like a lost cause." "It is." "Then why would they promote the event?" Anya threw him a shrewd glance, milkshake forgotten for a couple of seconds before she leaned towards him. "It depends on how kindly you think of the Chancellor's entourage." "Try me." She smiled, perhaps a bit cruelly. "Well, either they know the summit will be disturbed and hope to regain public favor by broadcasting the attack, or someone wants to bury what's left of Finis Valorum's credibility." Qui-Gon nearly recoiled at her harsh words. She gulped down a few delicious sips of milkshake, as he processed her sentence silently, internally very proud of rendering him speechless for at least some seconds. When she looked at him again, he was caressing his well-maintained beard pensively. "You are surprisingly well informed. Most of the Flight Academy sponsors are linked to the Trade Federation one way or another. I did my due diligence." He didn't look particularly convinced but didn't press on. "You gave me a lot to think about, thank you." They ordered some dessert, and Qui-Gon returned to lighter matters. From what she had understood, he wanted to see her to distract himself from the looming doomed summit, not to talk about it all night. After a couple of random questions on his uncle, busy with the outcomes of the High Serenian Council meetings they held earlier that summer, and on her own plans for the upcoming year, a ton of work and maybe some music sessions with the Senate Orchestra, he decided to bring up the topic she didn't want to elaborate on with anyone these days, and especially not him. "And how is Khan doing?" "How would I know?" She tried to look as virtuous as she could, but looking at his amused expression, she failed. Pouting slightly, she relented. He is doing fine, his last year of school is starting in 2 weeks. Are you going on holiday with him? He asked in an innocent tone. She huffed. I'm not telling you anything that will end up in my uncle's ear, Qui-Gon Jinn. He laughed, but it sounded a tad sad, and she guessed he hadn't gotten too much news from him recently. It distracted her slightly from her embarrassment. It felt nice, natural to have someone nagging her about a crush, but it didn't dispel the similarly natural wish she had that he never spoke of it again. The genie was not so intent on letting go of the matter. For what it is worth, you seem to match each other quite well. She tensed and played with her straw nervously. He was referring to the meditation, of course. She had been stupid to disregard what Qui-Gon himself had seen that night, too focused on her pain to even think about it. Had he seen the bond? Felt how their force signatures meshed naturally with one another when they were close? But was her attraction for him so obvious that it didn't even involve anything GD related? Unsure, she chose sarcasm. Don't say that to poor Obi-Wan, he is going to be devastated. I think I'm beginning to grow on him. Qui-Gon raised a brow at her deflection and decided to ignore it. She could feel his attitude was more serious now, and recognized at least a small amount of concern in his voice when he spoke again. You bonded quickly, and he seems like a nice boy. But... He looked at her, his face unreadable. He walks a fine line. Anya's eyes narrowed and her spine straightened at his statement. Did he feel Khan's dark side, or was it coming from somewhere else? In both cases it was worrying, but not for the reasons Qui-Gon had in mind. She trusted Khan to stay in control when he was using the dark side, and until now she had been right. Even on Corbin, he had managed to be kind and compassionate to her, while his eyes still glinted gold, and his force signature rang darker than a moonless night, and to her, that was worth something. Don't we all? The life of a force user is rarely an easy one, she deflected weakly. It is true, he replied, his eyes now distant, like he was remembering something, or someone. Qui-Gon? His comlink rang, cutting the conversation short. It seemed to be Obi-Wan, and apparently, it could not wait. Qui-Gon rose from his seat after hanging up, sighing. I have to go. I'll send you an holomail when I am back on Coruscant. Thank you. Have a nice holiday, Anya, he said, smiling. It seemed whatever bothered him previously had been either brushed aside or cast away. Thanks, try to come back from the summit in one piece, she mocked, her amusement evident, and a tad fake. He laughed, they paid and he left. She stood for a couple of seconds in front of the dinner, the crisp evening air sharpening her senses, then messaged her chauffeur to come and pick her up. She didn't know what exactly Qui-Gon was about to say, but she had a strong feeling he was about to warn her against entangling herself with Khan. He was right, perhaps even more than he knew. Strong romantic bonds tended to lead any Force user closer to the dark side. They could elicit fear of loss, jealousy, or selfishness, and the negative feelings had disastrous effects on one's relationship with the Force. In their situation in particular, being distracted from their plans and having their logical mind impaired by invasive emotions was stupidly dangerous, especially since they hadn't found a foolproof way to kill Palpatine, and definitely reroute the future yet without turning the Force against them, and potentially getting themselves killed. A part of her was afraid and tried to ignore the feelings that grew steadily each time they interacted and blossomed in her chest like weeds, vigorous and increasingly hard to contain. Another still thought about what could have happened when he touched her face in the training room, and did not care at all about any consequences. Whatever, it didn't matter. If Khan felt any attraction for her, anything at all really besides a vague sense of friendship, he didn't seem interested in acting on it after Corellia, and she was certainly not going to make the first step. It would mean shattering the balance they had at the moment, and potentially exposing herself to a heartbreaking rejection. Their silly infatuation didn't seem to impact their ability to work together, and they still very much needed each other for the realization of their plans. She would do nothing to change that. If their proximity came across as romantic to Qui-Gon or others, then so be it. She could bear more rumors about them being an item, even if it was wrong. Even if she wanted it to be true. Now 3rd series, simplified form, and we stop at the prancing failure stance. Yes, Khan, around 15 tiny voices replied, before diligently grabbing their wooden sticks and starting the kata. Su Li had roped him into doing a couple of extra sessions with the younglings to prepare for the beginning of the term. They had a couple of new faces, and he wanted them to have a light taste of what they could expect from the temple. Most of the others were children that had attended his classes since he had started giving them, and could demonstrate the forms to the new kids. It was meant to create some bonds between the students and reassure their parents, from what he had gathered. He had grudgingly accepted, mumbling and grumbling, but in all honesty it wasn't so bad. Your right hand should be higher. Better. Careful with your footing, you need to be well anchored for the next moves. Good, but don't tense the shoulders too much. There. He passed through the ranks, correcting postures and giving light praises, and noted who among the new additions was going to need a bit more help, and how they took his comments. Kids were tricky sometimes, and they didn't all react the same when he pointed their mistakes. Moreover, most were being picked up by their parents after class, and he had absolutely no desire to interact with them at all, which meant he couldn't traumatize their offspring by saying exactly what he had in mind when he watched them perform the overly simplified katas with wobbly legs and dreadful accuracy. Khan didn't remember being that clumsy, but well, time was known to soothe everything, and he did have an unusually harsh childhood compared to the kids he taught on Talarvin. What he did remember, however, was being terrified of being hit with one of the long, wooden canes the masters used to correct their students' postures at the Korskanti temple if he gave a subpar performance. It might have influenced significantly his desire to reach perfection as soon as he could, now that he thought back on it. He didn't use one during his own classes. When they finished the kata, the new kids were red-faced and mostly out of breath, but the others seemed relatively okay. Good, so there were improvements after all. He made them stretch for a while, correcting their poses again to avoid any injury, then they sat all around him with expectant eyes. You did very well, congratulations. So, can one of our new students tell me something a GD should know about handling a lightsaber? He asked, trying to keep his voice as gentle as he could to encourage them to speak. One pudgy kid that reacted very well to both criticism and praise raised his hand. He gestured for him to answer. You should never point it at your face. A couple of kids giggled, and he had to fight not to smile in amusement himself. That's a good answer. Anyone else? You should take very good care of it. A shyer one added in a timid tone. He hummed in approval. Also a very good answer. A GD Knight's lightsaber should be an extension of himself, and treated as such. The girl, the only one in the group of newbies, fidgeted a bit, then turned tomato red when he gazed at her. She answered with a trembling lip and shaky hands. He would need patience with this one. It should not be used lightly. He smiled, trying to convey kindness. Yes, that's perhaps the most important thing to remember. A lightsaber should only be used when there are no other options. Something he should probably have taken a lot more seriously in his time. Using a lightsaber requires training, practice, and discernment. It can cause severe injuries, both to yourself and others, and should be treated with the respect it deserves. Here, you can learn how to handle it safely, and how to defend yourself and others with it, using either wooden or training sabers, but you will not touch a real one until the masters deem you ready for this responsibility. Which meant never for 90% of them, but they didn't need to know that yet. He continued his lecture, asking them to name the different parts of a lightsaber, and then let them hit each other with the wooden sticks under his watchful eyes for a couple of minutes before dismissing the class for this time. The shy boy from before stayed behind, and his lower lip was trembling, which spelled trouble. Is there something wrong? The kid nodded slowly, wiggling under his gaze, and gave him a lost look. I'm really bad, I can feel it. You're getting started, it cannot be perfect. With patience and dedication, I'm sure you'll be able to grow, he replied, encouraging. Are you sure? The kid told him, neck bent oddly to be able to look at him. He was short, with short blonde hair and chubby cheeks, and with his mouth half open in a question and the dejected look in his eyes, he made him think of Darth. Master Skywalker, there are too many of them. What are we going to do? He gave the kid a tense smile as the memory tore open a bloody gash in his mind. I am. It seemed to do it. The child smiled back, nodded with teary eyes, and ran outside for absolutely no reason. Just like Sour's Bandium should have. Khan sighed and massaged his nose bridge for a moment, trying to fend off the waves of crippling guilt and never-ending shame that threatened to swallow him whole. Working with the younglings was nice enough, but had a nasty tendency to remind him relentlessly about the ones he had cut down. He thought back on the form that waited patiently in his holomail inbox and dismissed it immediately. That was just a stupid idea, and he was very much not going to do that. Sighing again, he cleaned up the room and headed out of the temple through a discreet entrance, just in case parents were waiting for him. He made his way home in full autopilot, still tortured by bloody memories, ate quickly, and checked he had packed everything he needed. He would depart tomorrow for Coruscant to pick up Anya, and he was more than a bit excited for the trip, which he firmly hoped would be nicer than the mess Corbin had devolved into. His leg was healed, but he was still plagued by nightmares nearly every night, usually dreadful variations on the same theme. How much of an awful person he was. Meditation hadn't helped, the pearl hadn't helped, he had even tried to get answers from Plagueis, but the Sith had just uttered the same promises the darkness always made him: power, galactic domination, immortality, all useless. Khan didn't want to be more powerful, he just wanted to be able to sleep properly at night. Perhaps if he went through with the no. He was absolutely not going to do that. He went to bed early, trying to find rest, but woke up shaking in the middle of the night a few hours later, after experiencing a very convincing rendition of the Korskanti Temple's massacre. Sleep did not come again after that. Nearly a day later, Khan was looking at Coruscant from the cockpit of his ship with a tight throat and a clenched jaw. The planet looked exactly like it did before the war, with the thrice-damned temple standing proud and endless lines of speeders stuck in traffic. He approached the Senate spaceport, communicating the senatorial codes that Anya gave him, and landed the ship gracefully on the Serenian pad. Initially, they were supposed to take off right away, but apparently Anya was stuck in a meeting that took longer than expected, with the Senate Committee for Intergalactic Relief, so he had at least another hour to kill before she could join him. He seriously considered spending it doing some maintenance on his hyperdrive, but the thing worked perfectly well, and it would be suspicious to do repairs on a Senate landing pad. He could also read the files sent to him by the Equani therapist he had reached out to on Talorvin, but he had a feeling it was mostly a basic contact detail form, and he still hadn't made his choice in between replying or giving up. It had been a spur-of-the-moment thing, and at the time, still weakened by his lightly infected leg and dazed by the pain meds, it had made total sense that Revan wanted him to get therapy to be a better Sith. Once the fever and painkillers-induced haze had faded, however, and he had woken up from a terrible nightmare to a notification thanking him for contacting the Equani and asking him to fill out the form, the entire thing had looked a lot less doable and a lot more ridiculed. Revan wanted him to embrace himself and let go of his fears, and on principle, Khan was all for it, but in practice, he didn't really know where to start. Embracing himself was hard considering he loathed his very existence on a regular basis, and letting go of his fears was only easy when an appropriate situation arose, like with Anya, where he had consciously decided to trust her, instead of letting his fear decide for him what the best course of action was. If he wanted to really work on it, he had a feeling it would require much more than just random stressful situations to make any significant progress. Plus, even disregarding Revan's comment, he was a mess and had been for ages, probably since before he was even freed by Qui-Gon Jinn. In the past, he had no real support from anyone he could trust apart from Palpatine, and that hadn't exactly solved anything. The Jedi had always been cryptic and not particularly empathetic to his peculiar upbringing. He had never wanted to embarrass himself in front of Padme, or to show any inadequacy to Obi-Wan. The clones had been good friends, but young beings all things considered and not close enough for him to share anything this personal, and droids had been well droids. He spared a quick thought to Yoda, his insufferable foggy wisdom and disappointed looks, when no one interpreted it the right way because it was so unclear in the first place. His calm eyes when he had told him of his nightmares about Padme, then his judgmental retort. He should rejoice for people he loved joining the Force, he should train himself to let go of everything he feared to lose. Never again. Khan had considered briefly talking about all of this to Anya, but he didn't want to put this on her, when she obviously had her own share of unresolved issues, and if he wanted to do this right, going with a professional sounded like the best option, even if he would probably have to lie or at least omit a lot of stuff. Criff, he was doing this. Worst case scenario, he would just kill the therapist and be done with the whole thing, no one had to know about it ever being a thing. Revan's words on being able to achieve balance without giving up on his attachments were music to his soul, and if talking about his past with a complete stranger for an hour a week was the price to pay, he would do it. He opened the form and grimaced. It was straightforward and easy to fill. Just his contact details, availability for appointments, and if he was referred by another therapist or not. He signed at the end, lips pinched, and clicked send with his eyes closed, feeling extremely ashamed by his childish behavior. It was done. He received a notification a couple of minutes later for a first appointment in 2 weeks, right before his academy classes resumed, and agreed with shaky hands before releasing a heavy sigh. At least, if he could help it, this Anakin Skywalker would never know the sheer humiliation he felt at reaching out for help, after being sort of whipped into doing it by an ancient Sith Lord with very convincing punishments. Anakin would be more adjusted, more in tune with himself, and he would have him if he needed to talk about tough subjects. He would know that when things got difficult, he could reach out instead of keeping everything to himself, and involuntarily destroying everything he cared for. He would be a better person than Khan ever was, and he would not be alone, he promised it to himself. As for Khan, well, Khan would try to fix himself enough to be able to achieve balance in his life, and avoid dooming the galaxy. Again. He pulled up his sleeve and looked at his arm pensively as he read the kitted inscription. Chosen one in one life, Sithari in the other, fate seemed to have a curious sense of irony. The twin prophecies had turned both Jedi and Sith mad at a time, and were all but forgotten nowadays, except for a select few. It was really the will of the Force that Qui-Gon Jinn, one of the last Jedi alive still aware of the dusty prophecy, had been the one to find him. Sighing again, he pushed away the thoughts and glanced at Coruscant below. He still had some time, and really that hyperdrive didn't need any fixing. Might as well go and grab something to eat while he was there, the trip was going to be quite long after all, and ration bars sucked. He considered the idea of taking the mask hidden in the cockpit with envy, but he was here as Khan Vader, and using it would only create additional possibilities for trouble. He grabbed his cloak, unloaded his speeder, and took off. It felt somewhat nice to cruise the town, nostalgic perhaps. He circled the Senate, past Padme's future apartment, then took the direction of the temple, and dove to lower levels to avoid the main road's constant traffic jam. The sun disappeared briefly as he pushed the speeder forward, staying just under the limit to avoid the Coruscant police force, while still playing a bit with the accelerator. His little trip brought him to Cocoa Town, probably because Anya had told about being at Dex's dinner the previous day, when she had given him the codes. He looked at the entrance in pure nostalgia for a couple of minutes, and then decided to go in. He ordered a couple of classics to go, mostly sandwiches and pastries that wouldn't require to be reheated, and was just walking out of the place when he felt something. Eyes narrowed, he lowered the brown bag that was hindering his sight, and his eyes met striking blue ones. Qui-Gon Jinn. Wasn't he there yesterday? He never struck him as the type to eat his feelings, but he had been a child at the time, and all things considered, he hadn't known the man very long either. Was Qui-Gon secretly a junk food addict? Mr. Vader. Khan nodded in his direction. Master Jinn. How are you? I'm fine, thank you, and yourself? He replied, disgustingly polite. Same wise, just picking up some food before flying out. Jinn's eyes sharpened in a way he wasn't sure he liked. Going on a trip. Visiting a familial estate, Khan trolled, pretending very hard that he wasn't completely freaking out about holding a conversation, while Obi-Wan Kenobi was staring at him. Well, I should not hold you any longer. Have a safe flight, and say hello to Anya for me, the Jedi said with a knowing smile. Will do, many thanks, Master Jinn. He headed back to his speeder, shoulders tense, and dropped his bag on the passenger seat. He could feel Qui-Gon's eyes on his back and the curiosity in Obi-Wan's force presence, reaching out unconsciously for his own. He would not turn back. He would not look. The speeder took off probably a bit too fast, but at that point, he just wanted to get away as fast as he could. Qui-Gon he could deal with, but Obi-Wan. The mixture of hatred, love, pain, and betrayal was bitter on his tongue and burned his heart like pure acid. It was too much, way too much to handle at the moment, while still keeping his signature somewhat light and non-threatening. He took a deep breath, held it, and released it slowly, then did it again, trying to rein in his emotions as he definitely sped a little on his way back to his ship. He embarked the speeder, docking it in the ship, put the bag in the kitchen area, went to the refresher, looked at himself in the mirror, and clenched his fingers painfully hard on the Durasteel sink. His eyes were flickering, the color changing back and forth as he held up a scream that would have burned his throat raw, his body trying to match his physical feelings, with the sensation tearing up his mind. Obi-Wan was alive, and still a Padawan, stupid braid and everything. He was still happy, with his master close to him and none of the grief that tainted the first years of their relationship. He was so blissfully ignorant of the cataclysm that was going to shake his life a few months from now, and led him to have the high grounds on Mustafar nearly 2 decades later. It made hating him a lot more difficult, but his soul demanded it, still, expected the hatred to burn and burn and burn like Mustafar had burned him, burn until there was nothing left, nothing but the dark side, nothing but passion, for peace was just a lie, an unachievable ideal desired only by fools. But didn't he himself desire balance? And wasn't balance a form of peace? He passed his now bruised hands in his long hair, and slowly sat on the floor, still trying to breathe as deeply as he could and failing, taming the flames until nothing burned anymore but his traumatized fingers. It worked, kind of, but the turmoil remained, and he had to force himself to breathe for an embarrassingly long time for someone that had no longer any respiratory issues. After a few long minutes, the moment finally passed and he rose, passing some water on his face before leaving the room. Okay, so the therapy thing might not be idiotic at all, after all. In a year, he was going to be subjected to random encounters like that frequently, and if not all of them would be as emotional as the one he just had with Obi-Wan. He couldn't afford to mess up because he was dissolving into a full-blown panic attack in front of someone. What if he lost it like this in front of Palpatine? He was just finishing a quick meditation, listening to Bird Luke sing and ignoring ugly puppy Plagueis' annoying yaps, when he felt Anya finally arrive on the platform with a distant growl in the Force. He went out carefully, taking some time to cage the dog again, and salute the bird before exiting his mental space, and opened the ramp with the Force. Anya was looking pissed, fists tight and brows knitted in an angry frown, and she climbed on board with fury in her steps, an elegant suitcase trailing behind her. He was about to ask if he had done something wrong, but she seemed to relax when she saw him. Good. Are you okay? I felt agitation in the bond, she asked, voice laced with concern. It's growing stronger then. Coruscant is a clouded planet in the Force, he deflected, unwilling to answer her. Khan? He sighed. I saw Obi-Wan when I went to buy food. Oh? She put her hand on his shoulder, and he felt her warmth travel all the way to his chest, spreading slowly to his limbs. It felt like being plunged into a pool of warm water after a cold day, and it brought a smile back on his face. Trying not to break the moment, he put his hand on hers and saw her tense then relax as well, a small sigh leaving her lips. Their bond hummed in contentment, sending tingles down their spines as they both took a step closer to each other, entranced by the effect. It felt like the training moment, but stronger, bigger, and this time there was nothing to interrupt them. Except themselves. Khan took the first step back, then a second, and the charm broke. He just had a mental breakdown. It was at best unsafe for his barely recovered stability. At worst, it would trigger something in Anya too and ruin their trip to Sojourn, the one he actually wanted to be fun. He cleared his throat, embarrassed. Thank you. Anya nodded without a word, eyes stubbornly fixated on the ground, and he closed the ramp before they headed to the cockpit and prepared for takeoff. The familiar process distracted him from thinking too much about what had just happened, and when they proceeded with the first hyperspace jump, he felt a lot more in control of himself. I picked up some things from Dex's if you are hungry. She smiled, making his stomach shudder nervously, and he had to fight to keep his face from showing his turmoil. Perfect. Thank you, Khan. Perhaps he was not that much more in control. The trip would take nearly a complete day, and they would be able to rest during the second, longest jump. He had arranged the resting space this time, washing the duvet they used the last time, and picking up pillows during an awkward trip to a furniture store in Malaysia, to make it more comfortable. If he was alone he would have probably slept on the thing bare and spared himself the troubles, but after what had happened on Corbin, he wanted Anya to feel at ease on the ship, and the neck cramps were anyway not worth it, especially given his current sleeping pattern. The couple of weeks in between the two trips had also given him enough time to interrogate the memories he got from Plagueis thoroughly, in order to learn as much as he could about the moon. Sojourn was originally some sort of spa planet for the richest customers of the intergalactic banking clan. It was gorgeous, posh, covered in exotic plants and rare animals, and probably deserted by any sentient presence at the moment. The place was usually guarded by the Chani Sun Guard, Plagueis and then Palpatine's secret security detail, but with Plagueis dead and Palpatine on Iriadu, it was unlikely that the guards remained on Sojourn. After all, the moon wasn't located on any map, and without clear directions could not be located at all. Without Plagueis there was no point in guarding an untraceable place. The Sith's fortress and laboratories were there, surrounded by a lush forest where hunting whatever beings had lost Plagueis' attention had once been a well-liked hobby for his guests. It was supposed to be his main base of operations, and housed important contracts and records from his numerous allies and enemies. The treasures the place held would be protected, for sure, but from what he had learned as Plagueis' heir and with the Force to help him, he should have no trouble accessing any places on Sojourn. There was one file he thought would be there, and he was kind of counting on it. Plagueis had not only been a Sith Lord, he had also been a Magister for the banking clan, and his great fortune would be better in his hands than Palpatine's, so finding the Sith's testament to ensure his money didn't end up in Sheev's grabby little paws was his #1 goal. The second one would be to steal the records of the experiments and destroy the labs, just in case Palpatine felt inspired by his late master's obsession, and chose to seek immortality a tad sooner than he had the first time, which would very much not suit their plans. For the rest, well, looting around in hopes of finding anything of interest would be suitable until they got tired of it and vacated the place, if possible, with nothing left for the other Sith to use. To be truly honest with himself, the entire thing was just a gigantic snub destined to make Sheev Palpatine as angry as he could without getting any of them caught yet. Oh, the vicious senator would probably guess the intruder was also Plagueis' murderer, and had for sure already investigated his master's untimely demise on Tatooine, but he would not learn anything more. Khan could already imagine the thunderous look on his face when he realized what they had done. He wondered what expression his face would sport when he'll finally kill him. He hadn't looked the first time. He was too focused on Luke's recent death, too enraged, too sad to care about Sidious's ugly mug when he understood his old apprentice had betrayed him. He would this time, he would commit his face to his memories, a treasured moment to remember for the rest of his life, one he would cherish. He would have done it already if it wasn't for Anya. She had told him no matter what she did during the few times Palpatine had forced her to come back in time during her imprisonment, the Force reverted to the usual pattern it was following before her return. True changes required either drastic actions or careful manipulations, the natural inertia of the weave of events bending and bouncing back otherwise. Palpatine had managed it at least once, forcing her to tell his past self about situations threatening his reign, but she had told Khan about 80% of the time. Nothing truly changed in the grand scheme of things, which, apparently, had been why she had been cast away on Biss. Palpatine had grown bored of learning about things he failed to impact. He had tried everything he could to amplify and control her powers, but nothing had truly changed how inflexible the Force was when one was trying to upset important future events. Palpatine was still young, at the moment. At the height of his natural power, and even without the title of Sith Master and the additional boost that came with it, he would be a great foe. Not one he would have any trouble taking on, though, not after Tatooine. He could kill him, but he had no way of knowing what the bounce back was going to be. What if he had contingency plans in place? Would another politician turn out to be a Sith Lord? Maybe he had already figured out some form of immortality and would disappear for decades, only to come back even stronger later on. What would become of Maul and Dooku? What would happen to Khan, an intruder in this timeline, an unnatural presence, if he went against the tide? What if the Force refused to go through with it? What if Palpatine killed him instead? All of their efforts would have been for nothing, and depending on how the killing went, Anya could end up locked up again under his watchful eyes. No, they had to be patient, to build a new path for themselves in this galaxy, to forge bonds, to create memories, to become key characters of the new future, and to start existing fully in this timeline. They would have to undermine Palpatine carefully, taking care of his influence before they could end his life. The less impact his death had on the future, the easier the kill would be, and considering he had 1,000 years of Sith's machinations backing him up, they most likely wouldn't have a solid shot at erasing his disgusting presence from the world before a couple of years. In the meantime, after stealing his title, Khan would steal Plagueis' money and remove dear Palpatine's access to his master's secrets. Satisfied with that thought, he finished his sandwich a tiny bit before the end of the first jump, savoring the greasy unhealthy taste he had missed all these years, then launched the second one, and went to take a shower and brush his teeth in the refresher. Anya was quietly reading some sort of novel on her datapad, her face lit up with a fond smile. After spending the first hours of their trip frowning at boring documents and furiously typing holomails, she was taking a much-needed break from the massive amount of work that had been dumped on her at the Senate Committee for Intergalactic Relief just before her departure. She had removed her makeup and fancy clothes a bit earlier for a more comfortable outfit after a quick shower, and he could smell the scent of the floral shampoo and body wash the ship was equipped with floating in the air. He got kind of used to the strong smell after having to use the ship's shower a handful of times, but there was no denying Anya wore it a lot better than him. Once done with his own nighttime ablutions, he got back to the cockpit to check that everything was going alright, then sat on the bunk, the scene oddly reminiscent of their first aid session on Corbin. I think I'll try to sleep now. Do you want to keep the bunk, or is it okay if we share? Khan asked, trying to keep his voice free of the discomfort he felt. Anya looked up, blushing slightly, then swallowed heavily before nodding. It's fine, thank you for the pillows by the way. He tried to smile, but it probably came out as a weirdly awkward grimace. You inspired me with the duvet. He winked, she laughed politely, and he mentally cringed. Seriously? That had been so lame. The fact that Sherry acted positively didn't quell his mortification. Was he already like that in the past? He knew he had lost most of his social skills after his drastic and rather traumatizing transition from Anakin to Vader, but with more than a year here as Khan, he had thought he was somewhat adequate at basic interactions. Apparently not that much. Still, his appalling tentative at being funny dispelled whatever tension the idea of sharing a bed elicited in her, which had been his first goal. Both satisfied and embarrassed, he wasted no time in claiming what was now his side of the bunk, hiding his reddened face in the pillow. Anya followed soon after, turning off her datapad before lying next to him awkwardly. The long hyperspace time had slowly made the ship colder than usual, diverting power from the heating systems to the engine to support a prolonged hyperspace journey, and he had to admit it was a bit too cold to sleep comfortably. He should have planned a second cover, instead of the criffing pillows. Idiot. He felt her shiver and considered moving closer, but even if she seemed much more relaxed and trusting than the last time they had slept next to each other, he was afraid of her reaction to any sort of close proximity. And of his reaction, too, although for what he supposed were vastly different reasons. After half an hour of restless ceiling watching, wondering how his life always seemed to somehow devolve into some tone-deaf, syrupy holodrama, when he was actively fighting against what he hesitated between calling the will of the Force or the will of the Bond, feeling Anya still trembling beside him, he cleared his throat and decided to be brave. Can I come closer? He droned, immediately wishing he had kept his mouth shut when he felt her stiffen. Anya stayed silent for a couple of breaths that seemed to last forever, making him regret ever asking the question. Sure, she finally whispered. From what he could feel from her in the Force, she seemed fine with the demand, probably realizing herself that no sleep would come in the glacial ship without it, but her answer hadn't been particularly enthusiastic either. He moved his pillow towards hers and she did the same, and they laid next to each other on their backs, shoulders touching only. It was better, even if the first minutes were definitely awkward, and just as before when they relaxed the bond hummed gladly, spreading much needed warmth in their veins. He fell asleep faster than he had since his return from Corbin, and his rest was troubled by no nightmare.